Dumbest leaders in the Soviet Union history. Imagine a world where an empire that spanned continents, defied the laws of geopolitics, and struck fear into the hearts of nations suddenly crumbled like a house of cards. Today we are diving deep into Soviet history and introducing you to some of the dumbest leaders in Soviet Union history. From the iron-fisted rule of Joseph Stalin to the final blow of Mikhail Gorbachev that led to the collapse of the USSR. This colossal nation wasn't just a place for furry headwear enthusiasts. It went through some serious plot twists. We're talking revolutions, world wars, and more drama. Let's waddle down memory lane and discover the surprising and often comical blunders and questionable decisions that left an indelible mark on Soviet history. 1. Joseph Stalin. Alrighty then, time to meet our first contestant in the dumbest leaders in Soviet Union history competition. The one and only Joseph Stalin. Imagine a guy with a mustache that could rival any hipster baristas. He's the life of the party, if the party involves gulags, purges, and a touch of totalitarianism. There was something quirky about his leadership style. Well, let's just say he had a knack for making people disappear faster than you can say borscht. But what really makes Stalin a contender in our competition are those oh-so-special policies of his. Ever heard of collectivization? It's like communism on steroids, and it left a trail of agricultural chaos and famine in its wake. And how can we forget the Great Purge? Stalin's idea of spring cleaning involved sending folks to the gulag, or even worse. Who needs enemies when you have a leader like that? But wait, there's more. Stalin's foreign policy could give any conspiracy theorist a run for their money. His alliance with Hitler was like the ultimate frenemy move in history. Now, let's not forget the man's historical context. He led the Soviet Union during World War II, and while he did help defeat the Nazis, he did so with a dose of paranoia that would make anyone's head spin. And what were the consequences of Stalin's reign of, shall we say, questionable choices? Well, a legacy of fear, distrust, and an iron curtain that separated Eastern and Western Europe for decades. This was our first contender, Joseph Stalin. A man with a mustache and a list of blunders longer than the Trans-Siberian Railway. Stalin's brutal rule, characterized by mass purges and political repression, created an atmosphere of fear and distrust within the Soviet society. This stifled dissent and suppressed any potential for internal reform. His economic policies, including forced collectivization, led to widespread famine and economic inefficiency, further eroding public support. Remember, folks, history's a bit like a circus, full of clowns, acrobatics, and jaw-dropping stunts. 2. Nikita Khrushchev. Time to meet our next contender, Nikita Khrushchev. He came to power after the era of Stalin with promises of reform. It was like the Soviet Union's version of a makeover show. Out with the old, in with the slightly less old. He dabbled in some early reforms like denouncing the crimes of his predecessor and giving peasants a bit more breathing room. But here's where it gets interesting. Nikita was known for his, shall we say, questionable decisions. He was on a political whiplash. On one side, he was praising Stalin, and on the next, he was condemning him. Oh, and speaking of questionable decisions, let's not forget the Cuban Missile Crisis. Nikita thought it would be a splendid idea to put some nukes in Cuba, right under the nose of the United States. Who needs diplomacy, right? The world held its breath, and the Cold War nearly went hot. It's like a real-life game of chicken, with humanity's future at stake. And guess what? This little escapade led to some pretty big consequences, like the world coming dangerously close to nuclear annihilation. So, what happened next was quite mind-boggling. He was quietly removed from office in a move that could rival any reality TV show's dramatic finale. Khrushchev's decision to place nuclear missiles in Cuba led to the Cuban Missile Crisis, a tense standoff with the United States. This confrontation damaged the Soviet Union's international reputation and strained its resources. While his efforts to de-Stalinize the country were commendable, they also exposed the cracks in the system and led to a loss of ideological unity. Stay tuned, folks, because this historical roller coaster is far from over. Next up, we'll meet the man who made Soviet leadership look like a never-ending sitcom. Leonid Brezhnev. Give a round of applause for the man who turned leadership into a never-ending nap fest, Leonid Brezhnev. He's like that grandpa who overstays his welcome at family gatherings, except he was in charge of an entire country for what felt like forever. This guy had a reign that stretched longer than your grandma's knitting project. His era was so stagnant they should have renamed it Brezhnovation. And speaking of stagnation, the Soviet Union under Brezhnev was like a car stuck in traffic on the highway to progress. The economy was about as lively as a pet rock, and political innovation was rarer than a unicorn sighting. But it wasn't all snooze fest and fuzzy slippers. Brezhnev had a knack for stirring the pot internationally, too. He thought it would be a great idea to invade Afghanistan as if it was the cool thing to do in the 80s. Surprise, surprise, that decision led to a quagmire that made quicksand look like a kiddie pool. The consequences? Well, let's just say it didn't help the Soviet Union's popularity in the world. And that was Leonid Brezhnev's role in the Soviet Union's decline. It's like he was the captain of a sinking ship, but instead of patching up the holes, he decided to throw a party in the ballroom. Leonid Brezhnev, a man whose legacy can be summed up in one word: zzz. Brezhnev's long tenure was marked by economic stagnation and political sclerosis. His failure to address economic inefficiencies and corruption weakened the Soviet economy. The Soviet invasion of Afghanistan drained the USSR's resources, both in terms of finances and public support, and faced international condemnation. 4. Yuri Andropov. Yuri Andropov, a name that sounds like it belongs to a James Bond villain. Yuri was like that short-lived sparkler on New Year's Eve. You blink, and you might miss him. So here's the deal. Yuri's time in the limelight was shorter than your average TikTok video. Why? Well, his health issues. But here's where Yuri really makes his mark in our dumbest leaders lineup. He had a bit of a problem with people who didn't quite see eye to eye with him. His dissent with everyone. He cracked down on it harder than a librarian with an overdue book. And when it came to human rights, Yuri had a creative approach. It was like he was playing a game of hide and seek, but instead of hiding, he was seeking anyone who dared speak out against the regime. But here's the kicker. The piece de resistance of Yuri's reign was the downing of Korean Air Flight 007. It was like a real-life thriller, with a plane mysteriously disappearing over Soviet airspace. He didn't have much of an impact on Soviet history. It's like he was a blip on the historical radar, here one moment and gone the next. Andropov's harsh crackdown on dissent stifled any potential for internal reform. His heavy-handed approach exacerbated social and political tensions. His short-lived leadership did not provide enough time to implement meaningful reforms or stabilize the country. 5. Mikhail Gorbachev. We've arrived at the last stop on our dumbest leaders in Soviet Union history tour. Get ready to meet the man who turned Soviet politics into a real-life magic show, Mikhail Gorbachev. He brought something new to the Soviet Union that was rare, a smile. He wasn't just about grinning and waving. Oh no, he had some grand plans. Enter glasnost and perestroika. Now those might sound like exotic dances, but they were actually his reform policies. Glasnost meant openness, which was a bit like throwing open the curtains in a dark room and saying, "Let there be light." Suddenly people could talk about politics without whispering in dark alleys. And then there was perestroika, which roughly translates to restructuring. Gorbachev wanted to give the Soviet economy a makeover, as if it was in desperate need of a fashion update. But hold on, here's where things get interesting. Those reforms had some unintended consequences. Suddenly, the Soviet Union was like a wild roller coaster with no brakes. And speaking of roller coasters, remember the Chernobyl disaster? It was like a nuclear-themed magic trick gone horribly wrong. Abracadabra! Oops, the reactor exploded. But here's the real kicker, and this is why Gorbachev deserves a spot on the list. He played a leading role in the Soviet Union's grand finale. Yep, he was the conductor of the dissolution orchestra. The Soviet Union crumbled, and the world watched in awe. It's like a massive game of Jenga, where one wrong move sent the whole tower crashing down. Mikhail Gorbachev was a man whose reforms were like pulling a rabbit out of a hat, but instead of a rabbit, it was the collapse of a superpower. Gorbachev's policies of openness and restructuring were intended to revitalize the Soviet system. However, they inadvertently unleashed a wave of political and social change, including increased demands for independence among Soviet republics. The Chernobyl nuclear disaster highlighted the systemic flaws and mismanagement within the Soviet system, eroding confidence in the government's ability to manage crises. Collapse of USSR. It seemed like a pre-planned collapse of the USSR, one after the other by these dumb political leaders. Collectively, the decisions made by these leaders weakened the Soviet Union's political, economic, and social foundations. They failed to address deep-seated issues within the system, and in some cases, their actions further exacerbated these problems. The economic inefficiency, political repression, and international isolation resulting from their decisions contributed to a sense of disillusionment among the Soviet population and the eventual dissolution of the USSR in 1991. Leadership isn't just about funny mustaches, questionable decisions, and political roller coasters. It's about shaping the course of history itself. These leaders, for better or worse, left their mark on the world. They remind us that leadership isn't just a seat at the table. It's about the consequences of the choices made while sitting in that seat. Drop your thoughts, comments, and maybe even some history jokes down below. We love a good laugh. If you enjoyed this historical roller coaster ride and want to keep quacking along with us through the annals of history, don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe, and ring the notification bell.